Welcome to Sex Ed with DB. I'm your host, DB. Let's get into it. To be very honest with you all, I am extremely worried about the state of sexual and reproductive health in the US and around the world and the direction that we're headed in. And I feel very overwhelmed. I don't know where to help or how to begin. So when I'm feeling that way, I listen to this podcast called Repros Fight Back. They talk about abortion, birth control access, sex ed, Black maternal health, LGBTQIA plus rights, and so much more. The host, Jenny, is super real and feels like your friend. She has cats, she bakes, she reads romance novels, and she asks the right questions you've always wanted to ask to leaders and advocates in reproductive rights, and then gives you things you can do to fight back. And you literally walk away feeling empowered and inspired. Their topics are vast, like how sexual and reproductive health and rights are provided in emergency settings, how Project 2025 is already in action, and how the administration and the Supreme Court are influencing our health and rights. So if you want to totally feel inspired, empowered, and in the know, go listen and subscribe to Repros Fight Back. You can find it on any podcast app. Hello. Welcome back to another episode. I am so excited to be here with you talking about virginity, one of the most ridiculous, patriarchal, and totally made up concepts in history. Where did this idea come from? Why does society care so much about it? And is there any actual science behind it? Giant spoiler alert, obviously no. But we are diving into this today because on this week's Rom-Com Vom, we took apart The 40-Year-Old Virgin with Caitlin Durante from the Bechdel cast. And it's a movie that basically says if you haven't had sex by a certain age, you're a loser and something's wrong with you. And not only is that very harmful, but it's also rooted in centuries of patriarchal bullshit that tells us our worth is tied to when, how, and if we've had sex. So today we are setting the record straight. But before we go on and on about this in detail, quick myth-busting section here. Number one, virginity is not a biological state. It is a social construct invented to control people, and especially women and marginalized folks. Number two, the hymen does not break or pop, and that is medical misinformation. We'll talk about the hymen a little bit more with a resource from Planned Parenthood in a bit. And number three, the pressure around virginity creates shame, anxiety, and erases queer experiences. When we talk about virginity in general, we assume we're talking about PV sex. And as we know, that is not the only kind of sex that happens. And so when we're talking about virginity in this hetero way, we erase queer experiences. Section 1, here we are. We have the patriarchal invention of virginity and just in general, virginity as property and control. So in ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome, those folks treated virginity as an economic asset. So women's purity was more valuable in a marriage contract. Very wild. In ancient Rome, Vestal virgins were revered until they had sex, and then they were punished or killed. Fantastic. Greek mythology celebrated chaste women like Athena and Artemis, reinforcing the idea that good women abstain from sex. When talking about also the Bible and Abrahamic religions, early Christian texts emphasize virginity as moral purity, specifically for women. The Hebrew word alma, often mistranslated as virgin, actually means young woman. Yikes. And medieval Christian Europe reinforced the Madonna-whore dichotomy, shaming sexually active women. So it's either you are a Madonna, you are, pure, you have not had sex, or if you have had sex, you're gross. So that is kind of ancient ideas of virginity when they came into play. And then I want to talk a little bit about the hymen myth and virginity testing. So let's talk about, from Planned Parenthood, about the hymen. What is it and what is the myth around it and what is the truth? So the hymen is a thin, fleshy tissue that's located at the opening of the vagina. And there's a lot of confusion about hymens out there. Most people think that it totally covers the opening of the vagina until it's stretched open or it breaks or it pops, but that's not the case. Most of the time, hymens naturally have a hole big enough for period blood to come out and for you to use a tampon comfortably. But some people are born with so little hymenal tissue that it seems like they don't even have one at all. And in rare cases, people have hymens that cover the entire vaginal opening, or the hole in their hymen is very small and they may need to see a doctor or medical professional for a minor procedure to remove that extra tissue. And just like other parts of our body, hymens are different for everyone. And, your hymen can be stretched open the first time you have vaginal sex, which might cause some pain or bleeding. That's, I feel like, what we hear about in movies of like, oh, did your hymen break the first time you had sex? But this doesn't happen to everyone. There are other ways that a hymen can be stretched open: riding a bike, doing sports, putting something in your vagina like a tampon or a finger or a sex toy. And once your hymen is stretched open, it cannot grow back. So the more you know, that's more info about your hymen. But there's this myth of like the intact hymen, right? Like science has debunked this idea that an intact hymen is equivalent to you being a virgin. Like the hymen varies in shape and elasticity. Again, many people are born without a visible one or one that has a hole in it already. So there's no way to test for virginity, yet many cultures still perform these invasive exams to determine it, which is really, really not okay. And we should really be thinking of this virginity testing as people having their consent violated and having a lack of agency. And some cultures use two finger tests to determine if a woman is a virgin. And this pseudoscience has been used in military, religious, legal systems to police women's sexuality and people with vulvas. Let's talk about the modern obsession with virginity. So, like, we're talking like 19th to 20th century. The Victorian era really glorified female purity, and sex ed in the early 1900s pushed virginity as a moral obligation. Like, you are morally obliged to become a virgin until marriage. And then again, that Madonna whore complex comes back of like, once you start having sex, you are a slut. That is how we are meant to believe that we are as women and queer people. And the eugenics movement used purity culture to control marginalized communities. And so, racism is definitely tied to this, tied to sexism, tied to misogyny. And this rise of purity culture kind of fast forward to the 90s and the early 2000s, where abstinence only education was getting, hundreds of millions of dollars pumped into it in the US. And there were purity pledges, hello to the Jonas Brothers in particular, who wore rings and wore items, jewelry, to promote the idea that virginity means that you have a self-worth. But this didn't really harm people like the Jonas Brothers. It really disproportionately harmed young women. Well, it might have harmed the Jonas Brothers, but you get what I mean. It mostly harmed young women, queer teens, survivors of sexual violence. And so, yeah, 90s and early 2000s, with the rise of ab-only education, really continued on this kind of virginity myth and this idea that like you are more worthful, you are worth more if you are a virgin. And let's kind of dismantle this fucking terrible construct now that we have a little bit of the history. It is a social construct, it is not scientific reality. And the idea of losing something reinforces shame and fear around sexuality. And again, it erases queer experiences. Like when we think about what really counts as a first time, if you're not someone who has sex with a penis, or if you're not someone who has sex with a vulva, like what does that mean? And so I think it's really important that we take the time and energy to reframe the conversation. So instead of losing your virginity, you are gaining sexual agency. Instead of this is pure versus impure, using consent and pleasure as guiding principles. Instead of heteronormative first times, creating personal definitions of sexual milestones and feeling comfortable and you trust the other person that you're having sex with. Like all of these things kind of flip the concept of virginity and the construct on its head and allows for us to have a sex positive view of when it comes to having sex for the first time or having a sexual milestone, right? And so, to conclude here, virginity is not biological. It is patriarchal, colonial, capitalist. It is a tool used to control people and to shame people, specifically women and queer people. And we need to be replacing purity culture with pleasure positive, inclusive sex education by continuing to talk about things like this, get the record straight. And, I guess like the thing that I'll leave you with is, what would sex look and feel like if we erase the fear of losing something? I invite you to rewrite that script with me. Check out the show notes. We will share the Planned Parenthood resource about the hymen. If this is an exciting episode to you, you learned one new thing, please share it with a friend who needs to hear it. And yeah, follow along for more myth-busting sex ed content. I am so lucky to be here with you. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. And again, virginity is a social construct. Pass it along. Love you guys. Bye. Our creator, host, and executive producer is me, Danielle Bezalel, aka DB. Our producer is Sadie Lidji. Our communications lead is Cathren Cohen. Our music theme is by Hook Sounds. Thanks so much to our featured guests, partners, and listeners. If you have a rom-com you remember from growing up and want us to cover it on Rom-Com Bomb, submit it to us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and leaving a comment on Spotify. Want to partner with us? Email us at sexedwithdb@gmail.com. For more sex ed content, follow us on Instagram @sexedwithdbpodcast. See you next time.